Hello, and welcome to the 5th video in my beginner scripting series. In this video, we will be covering remote events and remote functions. If you haven't seen our previous video on functions, I encourage you to watch it. A video link will be in the description.
Roll the intro.
A remote event allows for communication between a client and the server. The server can talk to all clients connected to the server or a specific client. A remote function is similar to a remote event with some key differences. The first difference is that the remote function can return a value. The second difference is that a remote function is invoked while a remote event is fired. A good real-life example of a remote event would be if you were to step on a piece of broken glass with your bare foot. An event would be fired from your foot to your brain, signaling there's a painful experience occurring on your foot. Your brain then connects to the event and produces a response, which is ultimately the feeling of pain. A real-life example of a remote function would be when you or your parent pays for something at the store. They give the cashier money, and the cashier returns a receipt to them. Real-life examples are good. However, we are interested in learning about the programming aspects that go along with remote events and remote functions. Before we get into that, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ding the bell so you don't miss out on any of these amazing tutorials. First things first, let's create a script in Server Script Service. Now that we have a script, we can go ahead and rename it to Remotes. Let's start by defining the services we will need on the server side. These services are the player's service and replicated storage service. Next, we will define some key variables. We will need to reference the events folder in replicated storage, which we will create in a bit, and the functions folder in replicated storage, which we will also create in a bit. Next, from these folders, we want to reference the kill event, remote event, and get quote, remote function. An important part of the getQuote remote function is the quotes. So let's define a table that holds some famous quotes. I found these only through a quick Google search. Next, let's create a basic function that checks if the player's character has been loaded. The p-call isn't necessary if you know how the function is going to be used, but I added it for extra safety. Now that all of that is completed, we want to connect to the kill event on the server. When a remote event or remote function is sent to the server from a client, the player that sent the remote event or remote function is included as the first parameter. In this case, the target that the player wants to kill is the second parameter. When the event is fired, we want to loop through all players in the game to see if the player we want to die can be found. If they are found, and their character is loaded, we want to eliminate them. Moving on, when the getQuote remote function is invoked on the server, we want to return a random quote from our quotes table. Now, we want to set up the client. Without the client, remote events and remote functions are useless. So let's create a local script in Stutter Player Scripts. We'll rename it to Remotes. Let's start by defining the services we will need on the client. For now, these services are the player service and the replicated storage service. Next, we'll define some key variables. We will need to reference the events folder in replicated storage, which we'll create in a bit, and the functions folder in replicated storage, which we'll also create in a bit. Next, from these folders, we want to reference the kill event, remote event, and get quote remote function. Now, we actually want to trigger the kill event remote event and get quote remote function using our keyboard. That requires the user input service, so let's define that back with the other services. When we begin input using a key, we want to check if the input has already been handled. If it has not been handled, we want to check if the key pressed was K. If it was, we will fire the kill event to the server, asking the server to kill us. If the key is instead a Q, we want to invoke the getQuoteRemote function and output the result that is returned. Alright, before we test this out, we want to create the remote event and remote function we are using. Now we can test it out. As you can see, our remote event and remote function are working as intended. That is all for this video. In the next video in this series, we will cover bindable events and bindable functions. Comment down below some real-world examples of remote events or remote functions. I would love to see what you come up with. Be sure to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new videos and subscribe for more content, and I will see you in the next video.